Hello and welcome to our next session of Politics of Code. So today we will look at technological data-driven representations of society. Modeling society is a different take on the idea that our digital technology is political. So it is much more using digital technology as a tool for the means of mapping what in the early days was called empirical social science. So there's a long history of using data and mathematical procedures to come up with a model of society. I mean, there has been census and people's surveys through the millennia. I mean, clearly in ancient Egypt, for example, and also we have these biblical records of the Romans doing a census when Jesus was born. I mean, you might know that from the Gospels. So there are thousands of years, basically, in all countries, all continents of the world, where data has been surveyed to come up with an idea about the subjects of society, which is the people living in a society. However, the modern form of that starts when people, so to say, left their comfort zone of the society they knew well, and that is in particular during the colonial times. So the British colonial government in India faced the enormous task that India is very big and very diverse and has in particular also a lot of people living there, and to make sense of that and to, properly oppress people there, they developed a systematic survey of India, of the Indian population. That is, comes not by accident in India and not in other parts of the British Empire. India itself had a very long tradition already in statistics and population surveying for their own governmental purposes. So that was merged. This is why in statistics we have an enormous amount of Indian contribution to the mathematics of probability theory and everything that you need basically to make sense of the data that you survey. There's a second big bucket of modeling society, and that is the idea of a planned economy. So if you think of the two major liberal ideas of economy that starts in the 19th century, so like 250 years ago maybe. So the one is that there is people, and these people basically act on their best self-interest. And that self-organizes in a magical way to a stable so-called equilibrium. So this leads then in the 20th century to so-called neoliberal school of economics, namely by the Austrian economist Hayek. So you don't need much data for that, because you believe in individual agency, and if the market is not in equilibrium, that's only temporary, and then it will kind of thermalize. A lot of thermodynamics in the 19th century fascination of thermalization, the steam engine, led to the development of this model. So this is the idea of a market equilibrium, which is not usually very much interested in data. Then there's a second bucket that kind of emerges almost at the same time, which is that of a planned economy. That is namely what comes out of Marxism, where you think of the economy being highly intertwined with the legal framework and the factors that are pre-existing in an economic society. Like, for example, the distribution of capital. So a typical Marxist approach would be to assess how the concentration of capital changes over time. So, for example, a law is changed regarding the taxation of land ownership. For example, land property tax or something like that is introduced, and then over time you measure if the concentration of land ownership changes by that law. For example, if fewer people own more land, or if land gets more evenly distributed. So you have political goals, and to achieve these goals, you think of steering the economy. And usually in most societies, we are somehow in between. I mean, most societies on the individual level allow quite some private agency. You are not really told for how much to sell your onions if you are a merchant in a market. I mean, even in most socialist societies, that was usually not very regulated. However, as a whole, the economy might be strictly regulated. And in Europe, for example, most countries are quite far on the regulated side. The same is certainly true in East Asia. And then we have, of course, the US and to some extent Latin America, which is much more on the liberal side of allowing more agency, at least in several of the economic branches. So the small image that I have here taken from a book by Eden Medina, who is a Chilean-American scholar, is from a totally new form of approaching a planned society that the Chilean president Allende envisioned in 1971. So that is 50 years ago, about the time when the UAE was founded. Chile found its way to what we would call today a strongly social democratic government. And the president, the socialist president Allende, saw clearly the economic failure that was going on in the Soviet Union, that the planned economy in the classic socialist societies was not leading anywhere. And to overcome the shortcomings of that, he installed a computer-based system called CyberSyn in 1971. And the idea is that the collective government, it's a workers' government, should in their decision making always have all the information to make educated decisions. And that is really one of the first fully, I would say, data-driven governmental approaches. I mean, no wonder when the US staged coup took place and the military junta under the leadership of notoriously horrible General Pinochet took over power in Chile, among many other horrible things that they did. But the first really noticeable kind of wiping out Allende's socialist dreams was completely smashing to pieces the project CyberSyn, and of course never coming back to it. So this is the kind of the framework of data-driven politics. However, interesting enough, it is not so much political agenda that fuels this modeling society. It is indeed something totally economical and has a lot to do with what we are talking here, which is media. So media needs audiences, and audiences finance the media, in particular the media technology. And since we are here in digital times, I kind of swapped media and tech, because I mean everything that I tell you about financing media, you can just extrapolate and use the same way for any kind of digital technology that faces a consumer market. So what can we do in finance, media, and tech? I mean, we can sell items. For example, we can sell a piece of newspaper. We can sell a tablet. There's a lot of things that we can sell. I mean, by the piece, so to say. And usually we think of sales as the product. So we go to the market and buy, for example, onions. Then we could subscribe to things. That is, of course, also very common in any kind of media technology. You subscribe to a newspaper, you subscribe to Netflix, but you could also subscribe to a service like, for example, a cloud storage service like Dropbox, for example. And then is the thing that seems to dominate most of media, which is advertising. Advertising, you don't sell the content of what you have to give out, like in a subscription. You sell the people who use it. Better to say, the attention that your audience gives to the content, but also the advertising that is displayed within the content. And then we have, in a way, the same thing, but with another target. That's public relations, where you are interested that people buy your story. And we will have a look at that too. And then we have an interesting alternative approach to that, which is kind of complementary, which is that the public, the society takes care of that. That can be in community-based approaches, if you think of Wikipedia, for example, or other community-based platforms, but that could also be via taxes or fees when the public takes direct ownership of their media. So let's start with the first part, the sales, so what we sell. There's a basic on how to sell things is that we measure. And in particular, we need that if we want money in advance, so someone gives us, for example, an investment or a loan or so, to buy our stocks, I mean to have the products ready to sell them, we might want to give them an idea how to evaluate what we have to sell. And so we need matrices to sell, and this is the beginning of this idea that we model the world around this in numbers. So just to throw a few terms to you that you should have heard. One of the key sales matrices in digital technology is the average revenue per user, ARPU. And if you ever end up in the startup or tech world, people will always say, well, what's the ARPU? What's the ARPU? And you say, well, my ARPU, for example, is usually per year. For example, Facebook's ARPU per year, as far as I remember, something like $30 or something like that. So that's how much they make by one user. I mean, of course, that's an average. It doesn't mean that each user that they have created as many dollars, as always, is average. I mean, it's usually worthwhile in segmenting that and says, who are the 20% of my users who create the most value? We will come to that. So that is a really important metrics is if you have a service or a media, is the monthly active users. You might have a huge subscription base, thinking of Facebook or other services where you create a profile, but not everyone is actually using the service. Many profiles are dead. So the monthly active users give a much better picture of how many people you can actually address in your medium. And then the total addressable market is how many people in theory could be reached with your medium. That's a tricky one because, I mean, that might not be so clear. For Facebook, that is, of course, all people who have a sufficiently powerful smartphone and a broadband internet connection, which is today about 5 or 6 billion people. So that is their total addressable market. I usually would narrow that down and say, I mean, who is actually, whose broadband connection is actually, so to say, cheap enough or in comparison to their buying power that you could actually find them. It's more easy to talk about, for example, what is the total addressable market for example, for coffee. You just look, children usually don't drink coffee, so you leave them out. So it's basically households with adults in them. And then you just think of how many households you have, and then that is your total addressable market for coffee. That doesn't mean that everyone wants coffee, but I mean, that is what you could, in theory, get. So that's about sales. You don't need so much modeling for sales otherwise. So we come back now to the more to the advertising side, because a lot of the advertising matrices are very well suited also to model any kind of other form of social technology sales. So subscription. So an interesting way of looking at subscription nowadays is software subscription. So I mean, we're speaking of politics of code anyway. So let's have a look at the main subscription market in the digital world. That's the cloud market. And here you see that the cloud market, has significant growth still. So it's by far not at any saturation. It's interesting to see also who are the big players in the different fields. I mean, I found that that was not. I found that quite interesting. When you think of cloud infrastructure, and then of course the hardware and software services, and it's different people actually who profit from that market. Mainly, of course, we think of Amazon and Google as the big cloud providers. So the cloud provider market in the US, for example, is about $90 billion per year and expected to double in very short time. Just a few more numbers here where you can see the IT spendings in the world and how cloud is a significant part of that. So it's about 6% of total IT spending. So if you think of IT being about 10% of the total economy, that's about it in the US, in Europe, in many parts of Asia. It's a very stable ratio. You could think of that as the value that digital technology provides to society. Is about 10% of the value creation in society, just as a rough estimate. And 6% of that currently is cloud services, but keep in mind, growing 40% per year, so will double in 2 or 3 years. If you just look at software, then cloud has a much higher percentage. It's almost 40%. So it's more than a third of all software is already cloud services. So here you can see the shift to services like Salesforce.com, for example, or Slack that completely replace, or Gmail also, that completely replace client-based solutions. And clearly there is something going on in terms of competition. Depending on how you count, Microsoft is still a relevant player in the cloud business because of Office. So the change of Microsoft about 10 years from a installation-based distribution to a cloud-based installation is full underway. I think it's a bit generous what this table says, that Microsoft is so much on top of things. If you would go to the to real cloud services, I guess Amazon is by far the biggest. So and the interesting things is that companies in the cloud, in particular Amazon, make a lot of money for their economies of scale. So with Amazon, I mean, everything that you buy on Amazon, they have to ship. So there's physical costs. And you see, I mean, that Amazon really doesn't go into the very local markets, for example, in grocery deliveries. That's a totally separate field that Amazon hasn't much touched. They have tried that out in the US. There are several big cities where they started the grocery delivery service, but that was never so successful compared to other services. And here, for example, in the UAE, it doesn't exist at all. So distribution is really an important factor for scaling. And if you use cloud services only in digital, I mean, of course, there is no absolutely no nothing increases in terms of local distribution costs. And this is so no surprise that the kind of services that Amazon provides, which is the web services, AWS, that is storage and computation power in the cloud, and the marketplace, which is Amazon provides the services, the search platform, the catalog, and to some extent also the logistics to third-party merchants, and that is more than they sell on their own. So, so the platform business for Amazon has become huge. Let's go back to media from this excursion to cloud businesses. There is, of course, a long tradition in subscription in media, in particular newspapers, that's hundreds of years, that there's at least 250 years of newspaper subscriptions. And if you see here the largest newspaper in the US, the New York Times, you see that despite general idea that newspapers are in decline, the circulation of the New York Times has gone up. So that means there is more New York Times printed now than there used to be 10 years ago, which is really interesting. That is certainly a different trend. However, advertising revenues are falling. So it's not that attractive for advertisers to advertise in the newspaper. If you look at the subscription numbers of the American newspapers, you get a rough idea what people pay. For example, the subscription of the New York Times, which roughly 4 million people who pay for that, is $2 per week. So this is how they can calculate. Television has never been historically a subscriber business. Television was mostly advertising financed or by public fees, as we shall see. So nevertheless, with cable, in many countries, people pay some kind of subscription fee to their cable providers and get more channels by that. What you see here in Benedict Evans' slide is that TV subscriptions, that means these cable subscriptions, have been in constant decline over the last 10 years. Well, but if you look a bit closer, then you see that actually the decline is almost fully compensated by new forms of television, which is, for example, Netflix. And others join, for example, Disney. So it's not true that people are not watching television, it just means that the pattern shifts. Interesting, however, is that teenagers seem not really to buy into the modern streaming services as much. However, go to other services like YouTube or even, like TikTok and the likes, which the traditional TV folks find very difficult as seeing them as competition in the first place, because the content is so radically different. However, you can only spend so many hours in front of a screen, so every minute that you spend on YouTube is a minute not spent on television. And certainly, the revenue model of YouTube is significantly different compared to that of Netflix. The interesting thing is how much investment Netflix puts into content production. So we will surely see very soon the streaming platforms outnumbering the amount that the traditional producers invest. And one thing is a change, just mentioning that as a side notice here. Traditionally, television production was local and was aired in your local television network, and then this network would license the production to other networks in other countries. So television was an international business. However, the revenues were created locally. For example, television stations in Germany, in France, or wherever, in Europe, would license American content, would pay a license fee, but then could make as much as they want in advertising revenues in their own markets. And then there is, of course, markets that used to be quite shut off even, I mean, France in particular, but also India with the largest television market in the world, basically relied completely on their own. And now comes these companies like Netflix that produce in an international way. You can't often even say, is that now a British, is it an American, or what production, and then distribute it worldwide. And most of it actually not in form of licensing it out to television stations. So that is really remarkable that Netflix is already at the level of the top 5 European markets together. So we will certainly see a change of that. And one, I mean, just a very short time ago, and a few days ago, the nominations for the Academy Awards. I mean, Netflix has received almost half of the nominations. And the second is Walt Disney. And the third is Amazon. So you see the 3 top streaming platforms basically completely get it. They have so much money that they can produce really good things, really high quality cinematic television at a quality that probably didn't exist before, and completely push out the traditional Hollywood studios, as you see. Yeah, and then comes the interesting question. I mean, why is subscription not the solution for everything if it creates beautiful content? Why do we have so much advertising? And so there is several arguments to that. I mean, that is, I think, one particularly pungent remark by Scott Galloway here, who teaches at NYU in New York, who basically says, well, I mean, if you think of like a subscription fee for Netflix in comparison to the traditional broadcast, it's basically a tax. So you could reverse the idea that you say, well, I mean, actually it's a blessing that we have so much free content that's advertising finance because everyone can access it. And that is certainly true for the network services like all the messaging platforms and also, of course, for YouTube. I mean, as much as I find it difficult how Google act in many ways, as you know, I appreciate that content on YouTube is available without subscription. And so, to some extent, I see the point here that you can't just flip a switch and just impose more subscription fees on people. In particular, I mean, how much are you able to pay per month anyway? I mean, how many $5 or $10 subscription can you collect? And if you listen to current discussion at the forefront of journalism, I mean, in a way, this subscriber model is really in a lot of trouble. Basically, the only platform in the US that actually makes money from it is the New York Times, I mean, as a journalism platform, and everyone else is really struggling. So the question is the paywall, is the subscription to a news service actually the solution that journalists should look for? And there is no right answer for that yet. So there is a crisis in the subscription services and a lot of transformation. Let's move further and look at the not subscription-based ways of financing. And clearly, advertising is online these days. It's not the same for every market. Clearly, the UK and Korea are the two markets that have a distribution like that. They are totally on top. In other markets, it's usually more towards the printed newspapers and television still. However, I mean, roughly speaking, you can expect that about half or more than half of advertising is now purely online. So there has a bit of a change happened, and to understand how that affects things, and in particular our topic, modeling society, I want to introduce a bit of advertising theory here, how the models of advertising work. Because advertising is really the main driver of these data-driven models of society. And it starts about 80, 90 years ago in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, advertising financed media become more and more a thing. So there's two main categories of media that are advertising financed at that time. The one is the newspaper. And in the newspaper, advertising shifts a bit from the so-called classified ads, which is ads that small businesses or private people put into the newspapers, usually just 1 or 2 lines, and you pay by the line. And it shifts to big brand building insertions. And these insertions might be as big as a fold, I mean, like 2 pages in the newspaper. And they are much more expensive. And they're the main drivers. And at the same time, also in the 1920s, a new medium becomes a major thing on the readership side and also in advertising, and that is the magazine. So the magazine is a often colorfully printed small booklet through which you can flip. And the interesting thing with magazine advertising is it is more sticky. I mean, the magazine has a longer life in your living room. People buy a magazine, it's a few dollars maybe, and then read through it over many days. So the advertising has a high chance of being seen several times. And that makes magazine advertising in the 1920s, and in particular after Second World War in the 1950s, 60s and so on, the preferred medium of advertising. So no wonder that at the 1920s, when the advertising becomes a huge business and a lot of money is shifting from content creation to advertising, that people started to think of how to make advertising in a scientific way better. Because there is this stupid saying by the American retail businessman, a Wanamaker, half of advertising is a waste of money. I just don't know which half. And that is just not true. It was true in the 1910s or so, because there was no statistics. But in the 20s, that changed, and people developed tools to understand how to do advertising right. And that increased advertising efficiency and effectiveness enormously. And one of the first ideas that people had to structure it is kind of seeing the ad not as just one ad fits all, but understanding that there is a process in how advertising works, which starts with getting people's attention. And then, when you have someone's attention, create interest in what you have to tell. And if people should give you money, you better make them desire what you have to give. And how to get the money then, that is to bring them in motion, to get action, that they actually go to the store and buy what you have to sell to them. And that is the so-called AIDA model that was published first by St. Elmo Lewis. This is one of the inventors of advertising psychology, and it's called the purchase funnel. And the purchase funnel can be a bit more granular. This is one that I found on the internet. I mean, there is no shortage of purchase funnels. If you Google that, it is, I mean, despite being 100 years almost old, it is totally a common thing that people in advertising still stick to. And in a way, most advertising models work that way. So this is another one that I found. It's called the journey. So it's not a funnel, it's a journey. So you start by getting awareness and then consideration. Someone purchases, has a good feeling with this purchase or her purchase, and then becomes a loyal returning customer. So, and I mean, of course, that is not always the same for every product. There is products that you where the service part is very little. But generally, I think this is, if you look at the commercial world, that is, yeah, that's still, it's very common to model what people do that way. Yeah, and here, just this is a 100 years old thing from the book by St. Edmund Lewis. So, you know, you take your profit and you have, of course, to allocate time. You have limited money for your ads, so you have to balance how your different funnel steps get paid for. And that is a super difficult process. It's called media budget allocation. I mean, that is now fully computerized, and people put a lot of work in that if you work in an advertising agency. I mean, that is really a discussion that goes on sometimes for weeks for a campaign. And the most expensive part of every campaign is media. And media means that putting what you have to say out. People understand always, or people have in mind from advertising, that it is about creation, that it is about having an ad copy that people find interesting, or that is funny, or that is memorable also. But that's the easy part. The hard part is making people see the ad in the first place and sufficiently often that they remember that. And so there's a lot of numbers in media planning. And remember, we are now mostly talking about the pre-digital media planning. It's the media planning for newspapers, for magazines, and for television and radio, of course. So we have a few things that you should have heard about, how our model of society works. So first of all, we think of target groups. I will talk about target groups in a minute. And with these target groups, there could be, for example, men aged 20 to 49. That is the main commercial target group, is men and women aged 20 to 49. That is just, that was developed, I think, in the 1950s, thinking of when people develop their stable consumption behaviors. That is when they left home and start buying stuff for themselves. And until the age when the children grow up and leave the house, which is about my age, you know, I'm already out of the target group. I'm above 49. So, and there is, of course, a lot of media, in particular the newspapers and also some television stations, who find that totally horrible, that you would say, well, only people 20 to 49 count, and who is older doesn't count. What about all the old people that they watch so much television? But that's always the advertising agency. There's an, they're the old people we get anyway. Let's concentrate on the people who are hard to get, which are people who work. So that's the most expensive, so to say, to get. And how do we measure the expensiveness of advertising target groups? It is as the cost per 1,000 people that I contact. So that's the CPM, cost per mille, cost per 1,000. And in other media, I mean, like in online media, this cost per thousand doesn't make so much sense. So you would rather think of an action-based cost, which could be, for example, cost per click or cost per thousand clicks, or the click-through rate. So these are measurements that measure how many people have been reached by your ad. And then you have softer, more psychological measurements that are much harder to get. For example, awareness. I mean, how do you know that someone is aware of your ad? Well, you better ask. And that's what advertising research is for. You survey people, you send interviews around and ask people, did you see over the last 2 weeks an ad for cars? And then people say, yes, yeah, I did. And then you say, could you remember some of the brands of cars that you have seen ads for? And then people say, well, I've seen an ad for Toyota and Nissan and Mercedes and whatever. So that's called unaided recall. So people are aware, they have seen ads, and then you ask them, which brands do you recall? And you can do that unaided, say, well, just make a list of all the brands that you can remember that you have seen ads, and then you give them, and which of the following brands have you seen? And that is a list that's called aided recall, where you then say, well, what about, for example, did you see an ad of Toyota over the last weeks? And then people say yes or no. And then the people who say yes, you say then, well, which of the following motives of the ad, which of the following copies do you remember? And that is then called the copy recall, that people actually remember the ad. Of course, advertising has one main goal, and that is changing attitude. That is, by the way, not limited to advertising. That's the same of political speech, of course, or of any kind of communication that is purpose-driven. So we have a goal. For example, the goal could be making our brand more sympathetic to people, or making it appear more sporty, or more soft, or whatever attribute you want actually to be connected to your brand, or make people think that a competitor's brand might have some issues. That could also be, of course, your political agenda. Make people understand your political agenda better. So this is changing attitude, and again, that is measured. There is all kinds of surveys going on all the time, trying to understand how that works, and that has not changed with online advertising. So how I measure who sees my ad and who clicks on it or so, that is of course very different from medium to medium. But changing attitude, that is not. I mean, I really have to understand if people did change. And then, of course, I have an effect that I want. That could, for example, be an order. And then I sum up how much that cost me. And then I understand how much my cost per order is. And better I get that low, because I, of course, can only have so much profit. And if my cost per order is very high, then I won't earn much money. So optimizing the cost per order is, I would say, one of the main goals in online advertising in particular. So just a brief look in how media measurement outside online looks. It has a funny history. I mean, this is in the London Museum of Science and Technology, in the new media department. This is the media measurement box that the BBC put out to measure what people would watch. So it has a clock and writes a protocol. And at that time, I mean in the 1950s, there were only 2 channels. There was BBC, which is fee-based, and there is ITV, which is advertising based. And so the measurement box needs to know what you are watching, and there was no electronic way of doing that. So your remote control, you would have a remote control for the box, and you would switch which channel you are watching in parallel to going to your TV set and switching the channel there. That has changed now, so this is how it's done these days. So it has not completely changed. You still have a box in your house if you belong to that panel. I'll talk about that in a second. And now it measures the sound. It's even if the television set is muted, it measures the sound of the channel that is switched on. So it's a box that is between the data, that could be digital data or an antenna, that goes into the box first, then the measurement takes place, and then your television screen or your computer screen is only a dumb screen, so all the smartness is in the box. So, and who is part of that? I mean, this is the German television measurement body, RGF, but it's the same basically everywhere in the world. It's just different companies behind it. The most difficult thing, as we shall see, is to understand whom to measure. Because, I mean, if you would, for example, measure me, I would hardly do any, I don't even have a television set, and didn't have one in a while. So a system like that would not create any data for me. So who do you find the right people? And we look into that. So this is television measurement. It's the most advanced, I would say, of all media measurements ever made. This is kind of the, I mean, people really put a lot of money into that. I mean, like tens of millions of euros per year in Germany alone, just to measure how many people of which demographic watch a certain program and see certain ads. For print, it's a bit more difficult. So the method that was developed in the early 20th century is the so-called recent readership survey. So how do you know who was reading a magazine or a newspaper? Well, you show them these little cards as well. Just put on the pile which of these you have seen, taken to hand, flipped through or read in. This is the question that is asked over the last 2 weeks. And by that you get what's called the wider audience and then or the wider readership. And then you do the same game again. And what about yesterday? Which of those did you have in hand, flipped through, or were reading in yesterday? And by that, get an idea how many people were actually using your, looking at your print product. It was originally developed in the UK as the National Readership Survey, NRS. So, and now we come to the target groups. And target groups is a funny thing, because usually, I mean, age is one thing, but you might be interested in other things. And now it gets a bit hairy, because this is also first developed by the National Readership Survey in the UK, but a very widespread method of classifying people in the so-called ABC grades. And if you look at how people are seen here, I mean, that is very discriminatory. I mean, you say, well, people belong to the upper class, or middle class, or lower middle class. And then comes the working class, and no one wants those. So advertising in, I would say, most Anglo-Saxon countries, you only book ABC audiences. You never book the D audience, and beware, never book an E audience, because these people, they can't afford your product anyway. You know, they are slackers there. And that is, of course, that's a really bad thing. I mean, if you think of advertising as a form of product offering that should be kind of open to anyone who is interested in, to everyone who wants it, I mean, that really excludes people. In television, I mean, still everyone can just switch on and watch a program that is very low in certain audiences. I mean, television is generally low in the better demographics and higher in the worse. I mean, this is just a measurement of time. And if you are unemployed or retired, you just have more time to watch television. So you get exposed to more advertising just automatically. And today that is the same, of course, of online media. However, in online advertising, I mean, a discrimination like that, of course, might make it very hard for certain people, and it might just unjustly exclude whole parts of the population. And of course, what it is really about is money. I mean, here you see the audiences in the UK in terms of their the money distribution. Clearly, the A people have a lot of money, and the E people have very little. Although the money is not used for splitting it, it's basically just your level of professionalism. And here you see, for example, the propensity to buy a new car over the target groups. And you see clearly, I mean, the more money you have, the more likely you are to buy a new car. And also, of course, to have shares in other companies or so. So this is a model society. This is why I bring it up. So you have in mind how the society is structured. It is stratified in that way. And that, just to show you, it is not only in the old, like Western markets. It's the same if you look into media planning in India. India has an incredibly advanced readership survey. I mean, it is one of the most advanced in the world and one of the most comprehensive what they do. And here you see it's done by face-to-face interviews, just like, for example, in Germany, the readership survey. And I mean, that's the methodological description of the India readership survey. And I mean, it's huge. I mean, if you look at that, I mean, it's 3.3 million people surveyed per year. I mean, really, there is people going from house to house and with their small tablet and doing exactly this card game that I showed you. And have you seen this newspaper yesterday? Have you seen? And imagine, I mean, all the languages are spoken in India. So, I mean, how much work goes into that? I mean, to have interviewers sent around who are able to kind of do that. And it's still worthwhile. It's still running like that. So that shows you also how much money is into that. And it is a model society. So what you see here, these dots, that is the sampling points. So in a country that is big, you of course have to kind of cluster people. So you can't just use the same thing fits all, because there is parts of India where it is very hard to get to people. And you have to put much more work there than, for example, in the big centers, like in Delhi, where you can send people going from house to house and have many people collected together very quickly. And also, of course, the country is very diverse. So you have to make sure, if you would just randomly sample people by walking from house to house, you would never get enough rich people into the sample, because there is just not that many rich people. And that's the same everywhere. So you have to over sample to get enough people, for example, that are rich, that are upper class. Or it's really difficult to get people who are working because they are not at their homes during the day. So you have to understand where to get people to make a sample, and that is called sampling. And the idea of this enormous effort that is taken is to have representation. So that means that your sample of 3.3 million people here represents the whole billion of Indian people. So in Germany, of course, Germany is much smaller. Germany has about 80 million people, and the sample size is, of course, much smaller. It's about 30,000 people. So it's like by the same order of magnitude smaller, you could say. So 30,000 interviews are conducted every year for the readership survey in Germany. So, and that is meant to represent. And representation is one of the strongest, I would say, paradigms in modeling a society. So what is representation? So representation is a form of aggregation. So aggregation means that you have a lot of things, but you can't deal with them all, so you form an aggregate. So for example, it comes, and this idea of aggregation comes from physics. So you have all the little gas molecules in the room, but you can't deal with that. So you find an aggregate that that describes the gas in the room. For example, temperature. The temperature distribution in the room. I mean, of course, it's the kinetic energy of the little gas molecules. There is nothing like temperature. Actually, temperature is an aggregate. And you find similar aggregates in modeling societies. The aggregation of representation means that you regard people that are close together as being sufficiently similar to one each other, that it is sufficient to take one of them and look at them. So you sample by saying, well, these people are very similar, so I only take a few and don't look at everyone. That is representative sampling. And in a way, I mean, that comes from democracy. So one person speaks for everyone in the constituency. That is the idea of sending a representative to parliament. So you have your village, which is the traditional form of constituency in a democracy. So like in early England or other parts of the medieval world, it's not entirely tied to Europe only. You have the problem that not everyone can go to the capital city and make decisions. So, I mean, you have to send one. And why does that work? Because you think of the people living in the village together as similar enough. So this is a nice illustration, I find, for the idea of representation. So you could think of a representative model of the society of Lego bricks in this box. So this box is our society. That's like the 1 billion people living in India, but it could also be people living in New York or whatever geographic location you want to sample. And you could say, well, we divide by color. So we choose randomly one red, one green, one blue, one black, one yellow, and one white, and send them into our survey and ask these single-colored bricks what they read, what television they watch or so, or we send them to parliament and let them make the decisions for all the others. But, I mean, if you look at that, I mean, color is just the most obvious choice. I mean, there's a lot of other criteria by which we could sample. For example, the size. And we could just count how many of the knobs. And there is 6 knobs, there's 8 knobs. And we could use the shape. I mean, is it like a 2x4 or a 8x1? I mean, they have the same number of knobs, but they're clearly in very different shape, and so on. So, I mean, in the end, it will become very granular. And, I mean, often enough, the decision just to go for color might be completely arbitrary and actually not do much good. I mean, in ancient times, if you had a village, the village, even the richer or the poorer peasants in the village, they were affected by the same things. If there was war, the war would go over everyone. If there was a famine, that would affect everyone. If the plague would hit, everyone is at risk. So, in a way, it makes sense to choose one of them more or less randomly. It could be any one of them and send them to parliament and let them speak for the others. But to what extent is that still true, that you can just geographically sample? Well, in advertising, you then randomly choose different forms. Like, for example, gender. A typical traditional way of segregating people in advertising in target groups is by gender. However, gender, if you look close enough, doesn't really tell much, Because, I mean, to be fair, if you live on your own, men and women, I mean, they just buy exactly the same things these days. That was, of course, not true 100 years ago. 100 years ago, that was strictly gendered. I mean, the consumption of men and women in most countries of the world was really different. But it has radically changed, and that has changed almost everywhere. I mean, if you live on your own, you do your meals on your own, so you just buy the same staple things in the supermarket, you buy the same detergent to wash your clothes and so on. And it's only in very hard, in the hard gendered fields like fashion or cosmetics that it actually makes sense to advertise for genders. So that is one field where I saw it change over the time of my professional life. So let's just ask ourselves, what has changed from this traditional form of separating people into target groups, of surveying people in this representative way, to online? I mean, first of all, in the traditional way, you just can't directly measure media. I mean, how would you measure if someone reads a newspaper? You have to ask people. And since that takes a lot of time and is really expensive, you have to kind of ask a small group of people. I mean, even if it's 3 million in India, but that's still comparably small if you think of the billion people that live in India. So you have to do it indirectly in the traditional media research. But with online, that's totally different. With online, you have each person interacting with your service on a one-on-one basis. And let's just look how that works. So in the syllabus, I gave you this link, this privacy analyzer. And if you click on that, you get on a site that shows you what the other side, like a web service provider or so, can know about you. So, I mean, I mentioned on the internet we have this one-on-one relationship, but what does that actually mean? So, it means that your web browser requests, as you know, files from the server, and to do so has to transmit all kinds of information. So while the other side selling newspapers or so only knows that how many people actually bought the newspaper by the revenues that they get back, they never firsthand know who had the newspaper in their hands, other than by then asking people. Well, it's different online. So let's just play that through, and then you get an idea. So we have an IP address. The IP address here is the protocol version 4. It's basically it's a unique identifier that is reported to the so-called lookup system. So I mean, there is a system of so-called routers that have lists of IP addresses and know in their lists which route to send the data to reach a certain address. So this address is a bit like a phone number or so, is unique to you, at least as long for one session. And it has a lot of things, as you see, just for the IP address, of course. You immediately see that you are here provided by NYU's internet, and that we are in Abu Dhabi. At that very basic level, of course, we already see that my browser is the Safari browser, so I have a Mac, and this is the resolution. And now comes a few suggestions. So this, for example, doesn't work because Safari is a contemporary browser, has a lot of precautions against vulnerabilities. So, and here we see, for example, that it also shows no accounts in which I am logged in. However, if we do the same in my Safari browser, in my so you see that many more things happen. Let's just see. That doesn't work either, but the user account, you see, my Gmail and my YouTube account show up. So YouTube has an API that other services can use, as you know, like for example for authentication. So being logged into your YouTube account shows you can probe that with easy requests in JavaScript. Then I can just check what my browser is up to. I mean, how much kind of features does my browser support. And then from all the information, the site creates a so-called fingerprint. So that's basically just looking at all the data that all the little bits. I mean, like a lot of people have a Mac, a lot of people have my screen resolution, a lot of people use Safari or Firefox, but all together with all the things, you get a very high probabilities that it is just me. Let's try another browser, the Tor browser. So let's see if that works. Sometimes in the UAE it doesn't, and I would have to go on the VPN. So let's see. The Tor browser is optimized for privacy, and that does not only mean that it uses this onion router protocol. That means it jumps through many servers before so kind of disguising the IP address, but it also means that it has, for example, a very limited resolution and size, so that I can't see the size. So I mean, here you see my IP address. So this is the version 6, and I'm here in Schönwalde, which is near Berlin. And Markus Koch is my internet provider, whom I don't know. And here you see this standard resolution. And if you now look, there is no user accounts. Let's see. This doesn't work, of course. The no user accounts, browser capabilities, very limited. And then the fingerprint analysis, of course, there can be a fingerprint analysis, but I'm much more generic now. And so it's much harder to track me down. And of course, as soon as you start interacting with the website, there is much more to learn. And I mean, the most you learn what people want, what people say. So it's no wonder that Google can offer such strong advertising placement, because I mean, what is better to understand what people want than knowing what they are looking for? And so I put this article and other information on how to understand online advertising planning into the syllabus as well. Generally, I mean, I have a lot of attribution option online. I can use the fingerprint to have cross-platform attribution. So I can just try to track you down over several platforms. I can do that as an advertiser, because as an advertiser, my ad is not served by the same server than the content. My ad is served by a net server, so all my ads I get the same information as an advertiser or an agency. I get the same information back. So I can use the fingerprinting. I can use all these measurements to re-identify and then know that you were the guy who already looked at the ads. Search interest, as mentioned, are super important. I mean, it could be just one. I mean, if I look for a hotel in Dubai, I mean, probably it makes some sense to display hotel recommendations then in Dubai. Sometimes that's a kind of seems of limited use, but I mean, on the other hand, I mean, people clearly optimize and measure if it really doesn't work. So it's this kind of you looked for a dish soap and then you get an order that by Amazon or Lulu's or wherever. And then for the next month, you get ads for dish soap, as if you would need another package of dish soap immediately after buying the one. So that seems often a bit counterintuitive. On the other hand, I mean, it's highly optimized. There's a lot of data behind it. One of the strongest forms of advertising that didn't exist before is collaborative filtering. Collaborative filtering works by the assumption that people who did what you did and did something else, that you might be also interested in this something else. This is what Amazon, for example, has. People who have these things in their basket have usually also this other thing in their basket. So maybe you need that also, and that is often true. People who bought these 3 books bought this 4th book. That is often books that are really interesting. So that's collaborative filtering. And collaborative filtering is really interesting because actually it doesn't really intrude privacy. It just tells you in a very descriptive way. It doesn't make much assumptions other than, well, I mean, people buy this and people buy that together. So why not offer that to you? So that's a very strong form of understanding people's minds. And then we have the review, the direct recommendation. And that's also called viral marketing or influencer marketing. So you get people to tell others how they like their product. And I mean, that is done commercially. I mean, it was always, I mean, there were whole magazines and TV shows filled with people showing you, I mean, kind of testing products. And this is a lot is going on like that on YouTube. I mean, people trying out new gadgets, people trying out cosmetics or whatever and showing how it works or it doesn't. So that's actually also, it's not very intrusive. And it's very expensive to buy your way in. I mean, if you want to have influencers, I mean, of course, you have to pay them money to do these kinds of things, to do that purposefully. And often it doesn't work because people get it and say, well, actually, that looks like a board review. However, it's usually worthwhile. So that's advertising. And advertising has completely changed. Advertising has completely changed the landscape because Google and Facebook and Amazon, the 3 big advertising platforms, each one of them is bigger than the traditional advertising market in most countries. So if you look at the advertising revenues, for example, in the US of Google, that's bigger than television, the total of television advertising. And that is probably really true across the world. So it has become much more attractive for people who want to sell something to use Google, Facebook, or Amazon as their media platform. And of course, I mean, the traditional media get under pressure from that. But it's the same, of course, with news consumption. I mean, you don't buy newspapers, as we have seen, as much as people used to do. So media behavior changes, eyeballs change, people give attention to different platforms, and at the same sense, the advertising money moves. But that doesn't mean that there is no market for media anymore. And now we move from advertising to a very similar form of spending your money for media, and that is public relations. Public relations has a history of also about 120 or so years. It starts around the time of the First World War and has a huge impact of 1920s politics in many countries of the world. where industrialists and other people who want to change things pay or buy media to advertise for their opinions. There can be political opinions like the Hugenberg press. So Hugenberg was a bit like Rupert Murdoch today in 1920s Germany, and he was afraid that a social democrat government in the long run would just create too much taxes. And so he would basically use all his newspapers to bring Hitler into power. You can only do that. If you own the newspaper and you can tell the journalists, please write this favorable article about Hitler and please write this unfavorable article about the Social Democrat. And clearly, we see a shift like that in news media in the US these days, when many of the very wealthy people suddenly have interest in owning media, in owning traditional media, for the purpose of influencing. And that is not limited to people, that is also companies. For example, the venture capital fund company Andreessen Horowitz, one of the more prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalist investment companies, has that as their corporate strategy now, that they use their own media power. So this is advertising and public relations. And now we look at the last option to fund. That is not so much tied to modeling society. However, it is very closely related to media, and that is using the community, using the public. And that, just to mention, has a very long tradition. The first to do so was the BBC. In 1920, one of the first public broadcasters in the world. That has to do with Marconi's wireless telegraph company. That was the inventor. Marconi was this Italian-British inventor who came up with the idea of radio transmissions. And from that Marconi wireless radio company, from that radio broadcast, comes the start of the British Broadcasting Corporation. At first, that was a private enterprise in the early 1920s. And in 1926, the British government decided to put it under public oversight because the influence on the public was seen as so enormous, and it was so important that people in the parliament, in the government, saw it as a threat to society if it would be still private. And just the numbers. So the BBC has about 4 billion British pounds in yearly fees that they get per household. So each household in the UK pays a fee. Apart from that, they have also about 2 billion pounds in license money. That is their commercial businesses is selling their programs to other broadcasters in other countries. So the same here in Germany, for example. Germany has a much more radical public broadcast system. It has 9 billion euros in yearly fees. It's also per household. The fee is really expensive. It's like almost 20 euros per month that you pay, and you are forced to pay it. There is no exemption, no matter if you have a television set or not. And the same in India. India has also a very rich public broadcaster, assisting the Prasar Bharati Indian broadcaster, which has an annual budget of about 30 billion rupees, which is roughly $500 million US. So although that is lower than the BBC, it is still a significant amount of money. India is very interesting. By the way, the Indian television production market is, or used to be, as large as the whole rest of the world together. So India is clearly regarding television, also now streaming services and video, clearly giving the pace to the rest of the world. And this idea of fee-based financing comes back. So Australia has just recently started a kind of a discussion, driven of course by the traditional press, to charge a fee on online media, like a digital tax or so. Although that failed, and it was a totally horribly disaster, really. I mean, of amateur lawmaking. I think that we will see that coming. There is no way that things will stay as they are now. We will see kind of a systematic rebuilding of public media in the internet, and that will be very interesting to watch and a lot of work to do, because I mean, clearly no one knows actually how to do that right, and there's a lot of conservative and kind of old school kind of media trying to kind of stop the internet and then hope that they can sell their newspapers or at least their newspaper websites in the future. On the other hand, of course, there is a lot to win. I mean, there is a lot to be said for platforms like, think of a Wikipedia like YouTube or things like that. I mean, that would be a nice thing to have, I guess. So this is really the outlook. I mean, to stick more in the modeling society, I want to invite you to go to the syllabus page and look what I have there. So at the topic of cellular automata. So cellular automata is one of the most playful, I think, small scale model societies that you can build. You have kind of these small agents, little cells that change their behavior depending on external stimulus, for example, how they are neighbored by other cells. There is videos on that that I made and also a lot of sample code.